Drug prices in America aren't high because of inflation. They're high because of how the system is built. Patents, pharmacy benefit managers, and other middlemen add layers of complexity to the system, which directly affects what you pay at the counter. If you don't understand these layers, you could end up paying more for the cost of your medications, even with insurance. Yeah, so generics are just delayed in the US, right? So there's a lot of history behind prescription cost expenditures over time, 10% increase since 1960. It's just a huge healthcare expense in the US. Out-of-pocket costs, and just a few years ago, we're approaching $100 billion, right? And that's 25% higher than what it was just 5 years ago. Most of our healthcare expenditure is drug costs, right? So what happened in 2003, Medicare, this system that kind of CMS, which oversees Medicare, which is the Medicare governing body, was banned from negotiating drug costs with the pharmaceutical companies. There was a bill passed in Congress when they started the Medicare Part D benefit, right? So drug companies just set whatever prices they wanted. There's no negotiation. This doesn't happen in other countries. Other countries mostly have a single payer system where the negotiation takes place with the pharmaceutical companies. What ends up happening obviously is sometimes, the taxpayer foots the bill through taxes, but also, you feel it at the counter, right? When drugs aren't covered or you need a formulary exemption, somebody wasn't aware. And the consumers were never meant to pay these retail costs, but it does happen, right? And so prices kind of skyrocketed out of control because of this, right? So patents, sometimes people say, well, do we have a longer or a more extensive patent process? And it's not that the process for the patents is longer. There's more extensions that happen in the US, right? So you can see they allow up to 5 extra years, right, to compensate for the FDA process, because the FDA process takes, you could have to go through 3 clinical trials in the FDA to get a drug approved. It's a very long, strenuous process. So generics, they can't use that data for a certain amount of time. For biologics, it's a lot longer, right? You can see it's 12 years. But what happens in the US is this process called evergreening, right? So they'll file dozens of follow-ups on the patent, extensions on the patent, which doesn't necessarily happen in other countries. And that delays the availability of generics here in the US, right? So data exclusivity, right? How you can see how the US compares to other countries, right? So small molecule drugs, biologics, you can see that extended period of time. So this 12-year biologic exclusivity, that's one of the longest in the world, right? So that's why you'll see, even when people, and we'll talk about some of the alternatives of getting drugs, like going to Canada and things like that, you'll see you can't get biologics as readily as you can some of the other drugs like blood thinners. Eliquis is a popular example, which we'll talk about. Right. So they have longer delays, right? And it's not just that the drugs are manufactured in the US. That's actually not the case. A lot of these medications use global supply networks, right? Where different ingredients are applied in different places. The bottle might have to say packaged in the US. That doesn't necessarily mean it was made in the US. It got packaged here because that's what the FDA requires to be on the label, right? But if you take Ozempic, for example, a lot of their supply chain is based in Denmark, right? And they have factories here in the US as well, in North Carolina. But again, not all of the development of the drug, the ingredients, it's not all coming from one place. It's a global supply chain. Okay. So this evergreening process, right? What happens in the US? They have multiple follow-up patents, right? So they might have a patent on a dosage. They can extend how long a generic may not be available because of these patent extensions, right? This doesn't typically happen in other countries because you can see, oftentimes the government has much more say in the price negotiations, right? So there comes, with that being said, people, they're advocates for single payer system. That's not what I'm doing here. There's some disadvantages to that, but this is just specifically why our prescription prices are a lot higher. So what can you do about it? Well, we'll talk about Eliquis, for example. Eliquis is a popular blood thinner. So you can see when the original patents are filed, and like the FDA approval didn't happen in the US till 2012. It's kind of crazy. So generics started becoming available a few years ago, right? And so dozens of these secondary patents were applied, right? So lawsuits were settled, further delaying the launch. You can see the US price retails around $600. International price is like 85% less, largely attributed to the ability to negotiate the drug prices, right? Now, part of the Inflation Reduction Act here in 2026, there are 10 drugs that were identified for cost negotiation, Eliquis being one of them. So you get about 25%, about a 75% reduction in the retail costs. Like so if somebody's on Medicare, they have a deductible. Maybe they're not paying $500 when they first get the drug. They're paying $200 or $175 as they're paying towards the deductible, right? Which is still actually more than what you could get the drug for in other places. Okay, so Ozempic. This is another one. This is a biologic, right? So this biologic exclusivity in the US takes a lot longer. We talked about this global supply chain with Ozempic as well. So it's not just because the drug is made, developed in the US, packaged in the US, right? So again, it all comes down to this price negotiation. And a lot of this, when they started the Medicare Part D program in 2003, that was part of it. That kind of brought the pharmaceutical companies to the table because they could kind of set the prices. Right. So let's talk about some of the other things that that you can do. Right. So cost. If you look at this example, this is from Medicare.gov. You can see this is with insurance. What you'd pay for Eliquis, you're around that low 100, 127, $120 a month. That's with insurance, right? Medicare Part D, they have a limit on what you can pay over the course of the year for your prescription costs, which in 2026 is $2,100. But still, if you're paying that $127 a month, you're not reaching that out-of-pocket max. So your costs are still high. You can see here too what it is on GoodRx. You can see the reduction in the retail price from that $500 to $600 range, but still higher than what you're paying with insurance, right? Another place you can get the drug, the Canadian Med Store, right over the border in Canada, you can get the drug for $50 a month. So even with insurance, some of these drugs are going to be cheaper by getting them through other means, right? Like the Canadian Med Store. A lot of times, again, we import a lot of stuff from Canada. People don't always say, oh, it's made in Canada, I can't take it, right? And again, they're using this same global supply chain for a lot of these medications, right? Same drug, just packaged in a different country. They can negotiate these lower prices. So a lot of times people have that concern, oh, it's not the same drug. That's not the case with a branded Eliquis that's available. And a lot of these drugs are going to be available in generic form earlier in other countries. So if you're still finding yourself paying higher amounts for drug costs, even with insurance, you have drugs that aren't getting approved with insurance, like GLP-1s are a popular one. Now, the biologics, that's always a tough one because, it takes longer for there to be an alternative. They're just more expensive in general. A lot of times you can't get those biologics shipped. So those are a little tougher, but a lot of the brand name drugs, there are alternatives available at lower cost, even when you have insurance. So other ways that the Part D program works for Medicare, you can check this video out right here as well. That'll give you a lot more information on this topic.